And we will get started. All right. Well, Shabbat Shalom to everyone again. And there's lots to talk about this week. This is a really fun portion. I like this Torah portion. I like them all, but this one just has a lot of variety in it. So we get to talk about holiness and ritual purity and the calendar, all in one tidy little Torah portion. So last week, I'm gonna kind of go back and connect a little bit with last week's portion. Well, one of the portions from last week. Last week we had a double portion, which is a calendar issue. So we can talk about that when we get to the talking about the feast. But I think we talked a little bit about how kind of the holiness for the Kedoshim in Leviticus 19, which in the TLV is titled the Holiness Code. We talked about that kind of reiterating the 10 words, I think. Did we talk about that a little bit in here? I think we did, maybe. I think Lon sort of made that connection a little bit.
I did.
So what I did, and we don't necessarily have to go through unless you guys really want to, I was curious to see if every part of it was in, like if all the 10 words were represented. So I went through the 10 words from Exodus 20 and then looked through Leviticus 19 to see exactly how things matched up. So I actually went through and found all the verses that match up, and that was kind of fun. So there's a fun little activity that you can do if you're looking for something to do on that. The only one that I wouldn't say I saw like specifically stated in Leviticus 19 is do not murder, but Leviticus 19 is kind of all about how you treat your neighbor and how you, how you're supposed to be kind to them and not cheat them and, all those things. And so I think we can kind of make the assumption that you also shouldn't murder your neighbor. So I don't think that's too far of a stretch. Yeah, right. But, I guess if you want to argue with me about that, you're welcome to. But so I thought what was really interesting about that is just how, and I taught the 9 to 12-year-old Shabbat school class last week also, and we talked about this. But what really stuck out to me about the way that holiness is presented in Leviticus 19 is that it's really practical. And, I think we kind of think at least I always used to have kind of the association of holiness as kind of like this spiritual heart thing. And of course your heart posture is involved because it matters your motivation behind all of these things. And it matters, that definitely plays a part in it, but all the things that are talked about in Leviticus 19 are all very practical things. Honoring your father and mother, keeping the Shabbat, not lying, not cheating, not stealing, not, how you treat all these other people. And also, which we've talked about this with the 10 words as well, is that, it's really, you can simplify it down. We see kind of this principle restated again in some ways that you can kind of simplify it down to love God, love neighbor, right? And it's just, this is kind of unpacking what it means to love God and love neighbor. So I actually really liked that passage just because I feel like it is like just a practical way of thinking about holiness and thinking about how we live our lives in the day-to-day and just how we interact with people, how we do business. And even in Leviticus 19, in verse 33, it talks about if an outsider dwells with you in your land, you should do him no wrong. So it talks about how we treat other people, excuse me, and again at the very end, so the 10 words in Leviticus 20, what's the beginning of the 10 words? What's the first of the 10 words? In Exodus 20. Which I think is the same in the Deuteronomy passage right there.
Isn't it love God?
Yes and no.
You are. No.
Yeah, I think you're right, Laura.
Or do not.
So in Exodus 22, verse 2.
I mean, the first one is you shall know other gods, but verse 2 is before. You're talking just specifically verse 2, or just where it starts?
So verse 2 is the beginning of the 10 words,
It's
particularly in traditional
I am
Judaism.
Adonai. I am
Verse
Adonai.
2 is the first of the 10 words.
Yeah, so it's I am Adonai.
I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of
Right.
Egypt. And I think, what does it say? Be holy. I didn't write the whole thing down. Be holy as I am holy, or for I am holy, or something. Does it talk about holiness in that one? I can't remember.
Out of the house of bondage.
Yes. I should just look at it. Yes, out of the house of bondage. Thank you. So, Judaism considers that the first of the 10 words. Christianity, we tend to. So then it gets really challenging on how you count them. So, there's a lot of debate on how you would number them, but for our purposes right now, it doesn't really matter. So we're not gonna fight about that right now. But it's God identifying himself, and that's what makes this important. And so then looking at Leviticus 19 starts with, in verse 2, says, speak to the congregation of Bnei Israel and tell them, you shall be kadoshim, the holy ones. Kadosh is a variation of kadosh, which is holy. So the holy ones, for I, Adonai, am your God, am holy. He gives all this instruction. Again, much of it lines up with the 10 words. And then at the very end, really in the context of the outsider within their midst and kind of how they are to be an honorable people, Leviticus 19 kind of ends with this restatement that I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So part of God identifying him as this God who has delivered and who is rescuing and who has brought them out is an important part to the instruction, because that's what makes everything make sense and what gives it the context of how he's giving all of the rest of the instruction. So keeping kind of some of that in mind, and just even some of how it's connected with the 10 words, and just even the practical nature of this idea of holiness that we have from Leviticus 19, if we go back to Leviticus 21, which is the first part of this week's portion, Leviticus 21 and 22 is giving the holiness code for the Kohanim, which is the priests. So, looking through these sections, so if we kind of were to read through a lot of these chapters, we start to see kind of it kind of starts to build upon some of the things that we've already talked about and that we've already seen in Leviticus 19 with the holiness code for everyone, basically, which makes sense, right? Because the priests are kind of, I don't know, they're not better than, but they're different. They have a different role in the community, right? And so it would make sense that they have some different instruction and some different requirements. But the other thing that's interesting, and I was kind of excited about this because we didn't have Torah study of the week that this portion came up before, is that many of the instructions for the Kohanim are kind of an intensified or more specific version of the requirements of the instructions regarding ritual purity. And we, like I said, we didn't have Torah study of the week that ritual purity came up back in Leviticus. It kind of talks about it a couple times, but back through Leviticus 12 through kind of 15, I think. It might come up again a little bit after that. So we didn't really get to talk about all of that. So we can talk about it now because it's talking about it with the priests. Isn't that exciting? Everybody wants to talk about ritual purity, right?
Yeah, of course.
So, does anyone remember or know So when we talk about ritual purity or what makes you ritually impure, there are kind of three main categories of those things. Does anybody know what they are? Or know what some of the things are that make you ritually impure?
Get contact with the dead body.
Mm-hmm. That's one.
Eating something dedicated to an idol?
That's probably kind of an additional one, but that's not one of the three main.
Okay.
The three main ones that would make you ritually impure.
Having a baby?
Yes. So having babies associated with basically bodily fluids, we'll say blood, because blood is a part of that. Blood and discharges and different things like that. So that's another category. And then there's one more.
Don't they talk a lot about leprosy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the third one. So leprosy or skin disease, whichever you want to call it. It's often translated as leprosy. A lot of debate about exactly what the disease that they're talking about is. Skin disease is good enough. So yes, corpses, dead bodies, discharges in blood, leprosy. So these are the things that make you ritually impure. So if you keep that in mind and kind of scan back through Leviticus 21 and 22, you will start to notice that many of those things come up because it talks about even the Kohanim, if, which of their family members they're even really allowed to really mourn, which is kind of a challenging thing. It talks about in, verses really 1 and 2 through 4, it says that the Kohen is not to allow himself to become unclean for the dead, except for his relatives that are nearest to him, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister who's near to him and has no husband. So for those people, he's allowed to become unclean and mourn, but for other people, that he's not supposed to be. But then if you skip down to verse 10,
Which chapter?
Leviticus 21, sorry. We talk about the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and maybe it's not right there. Yeah, nor he should not go near any dead person, defiling himself even for his father or his mother. So, the restrictions, my point is that the restrictions are even more intense for the Kohanim. So, why is this? Why would these people need to have more intense or more strict guidelines as far as ritual purity specifically? What is ritual purity about? What is
Coming in God's presence,
mhm.
and the priest gets closer than most of the other people. Maybe.
Mhm.
That's why they need to have a little more concern about they're getting closest to him.
Right.
Plus, they're responsible for the spiritual well-being in a way or being the example for the whole congregation, let's call it that.
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. So if you are ritually impure, does that imply that you have sinned?
Not necessarily.
Right. And that's a really important distinction. Because I think, and this goes back to how many of us probably were taught to regard a lot of the instructions in Leviticus or have thought about the sacrificial system, that we think that it's all about sin. And ritual purity is a really unique situation where it's not. Because because if you think about it, the things that make you ritually impure, some people debate on the skin disease because we do have stories, of course, in Scripture where God kind of strikes a person with this skin disease as a punishment. So that becomes a gray area, but I don't think that we could draw a hard line that says every case of the skin disease is a punishment for sin or something like that.
That could even include a bad case of acne then, could it?
Yeah. We don't know the specifications of this particular skin disease, but these other categories, someone who's died or these other naturally occurring bodily functions, you don't have any control over those things, right? So it's just a part of life. So,
Well, they have this process of cleansing if you do become impure. So isn't that sort of parallel to when we fall into circumstances that are that might make us unclean in the spiritual sense or the bodily sense now that we're believers? There's a way that the Lord can cleanse us from the unrighteousness that we knowingly or unknowingly may fall into?
yes, I think that you're right. However, I do want to make sure we draw the really clear distinction that being ritually impure does not make you unrighteous or sinful.
Right,
I want to make sure we clearly delineate that, because I think I'm just trying to be really, a little bit black and white in this situation, which very often we can't do, but I think that we tend to default to lumping some of this ritual purity stuff in with sin.
Right.
But I think it's really important that we don't do that, and that we are intentionally separating that from sin, because it is about coming into the presence of God. It's about being in, at this point in time, the tabernacle, later the temple. These are just things that God says that, if you're in these circumstances, you can't come into the tabernacle. So in the context of our current Torah portion, where we're talking about the priests, they have to be a little bit more strict, because they are on, they are the ones on a daily basis, like you're saying, they are going to go into the tabernacle and be, that's their appointed place. So in some sense, it requires a little bit more personal sacrifice to be in the presence of God. Again, that doesn't mean, I'm not saying that we should look at them as an elevated status. It's just a different role that they're playing. So a couple of weeks ago, my professor of my current course was having a discussion with another scholar who has written a book about ritual impurity in the first century and Second Temple Judaism, and specifically looking at how Yeshua interacts with these issues of ritual purity, which I found really interesting, and made my small group watch with me. I guess that's either the blessing or the curse of being in a small group with me, is that my coursework works its way into small group. But it was a really interesting discussion, because he did, the way that he framed it, I thought was a really interesting, kind of his overall framing was a really helpful construct to help us I think that could help us break out of this idea of ritual purity having any connection with sin or unrighteousness. So one of the things that he said was he kind of split the categories and contrasted ritual impurity with moral impurity, which moral impurity would be sin, right? It would be violating basically all of these other instructions and commandments that we already talked about, with the connection of, even looking back a couple chapters to that Leviticus 19 holiness code for the Kohanim, or not the Kohanim, the Kedoshim. The word sounds too familiar or too similar. Connecting with the 10 words. So, moral impurity would be a sin issue, where ritual impurity is really not. Kind of like we've already been talking about. It's really just about whether or not you can enter the tabernacle. So, in some sense, and there's kind of various opinions and various evidence about how this played out outside of Jerusalem. But, so of course, if you live in Jerusalem, if you're Jewish in the first century, you live in Jerusalem, or in this case, if you're in the wilderness with the people of Israel, with around the tabernacle, most people are probably going to be observing these ritual purity laws, I guess, instructions. But if you think about it, And I've kind of been taught a couple different things, and I asked a question about this during this talk, is that outside of Jerusalem, there were kind of varied views of whether or not it was important to remain ritually impure, because again, ritual impurity is about being able to enter the tabernacle, or the temple, depending on what time period we're talking about, you know what I mean? So if you're living, so basically, and one thing that he said, that archaeologically they've found over 800 ritual immersion baths, because immersing is part of regaining your ritual purity after you've had that situation that makes you ritually impure, so you have to immerse. They've found over 800 immersion baths in various places around Israel. So it seems like there were at least some people who were observing this all the time, whether or not they were in Jerusalem. But I would imagine, again, I haven't researched this fully, but I would imagine, you get farther out, you're living outside the land of Israel in Second Temple period. This probably wasn't really a main concern for you, unless you were going to make a journey to Jerusalem for the feast, which we talk about a little bit later in this portion. Then you probably would start to observe it a little bit more. So I think there's even, a varied level of observance, again, depending on who you are, which I think demonstrates even the point that it doesn't make you, it's not a status symbol. It's it depends on where you live and what your life is like and what you're called to do, right? So, but if you're going to enter the holiest place, then it requires a little bit of self-denial and a little bit of preparation. It requires some intentionality. If you know that you're going to be going into the temple, you have to think about that, and you have to think about what that means, and you have to take time to prepare, which I think I would argue is kind of the application for us. That, if we are thinking about being in the presence of God, we're thinking about this practical holiness that we talked about a little while ago with some of the things outlined in Leviticus 19. We also can think about this kind of practical, I don't know, don't hold me to this term, it's maybe a working title, but this practical ritual purity, I guess you could say. I'm not suggesting we follow all of these guidelines, but I am suggesting that we take, I think we can think about some other principles, even, fasting or different things, or dedicated time in prayer, and just thinking about the condition of your heart, the condition of your body, the condition of your being, of your embodied self, coming into the presence of God. I think that there's something about the intentionality of that that's important that we remember about this. I even think of growing up, I went to a Lutheran church, and it was more formal than here. Here we come and a lot of us wear jeans, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but when I was growing up, you did not wear jeans to church. You dressed, you went to church freshly showered in your nicer clothes, right?
Yep.
You didn't walk in.
Huh? Sunday go to meeting.
Yeah.
They have to go to meeting clothes.
We have the term Sunday best for a reason, right?
Right.
And I think that there's something to that. I think it's just, it's a way that kind of this idea of caring about your presentation when you come before the Lord. And again, I think your heart posture comes into play here too, because I think it's easy to look nice so that everybody else sees that you're looking nice. But it really needs to come about. I remember being at summer camp when I was in middle school or something, and we would have, chapel service or whatever. And we were at camp, so they were like, you don't have to dress up. But everybody always would want to dress up one or two nights for some reason. They're like, but if you dress up, don't do it for, whatever, because it's summer camp. So it's all the summer camp drama between guys and girls and all that, all that mess. But it's like, you dress up because it's for the Lord, not for someone else. And it's like, when you're 13, it's like, what does that even mean? But, but you know what I mean? Like that's what I was thinking about. I'm like, yeah, no one is, anyway. But, so it does come back to the connection of the heart posture has to match what your action is. So that's one way I think that we can kind of apply.
Emma?
Yes.
One thing I was thinking about these these laws.
Mhm.
Let me step. I don't know if they can hear me or not here, but
I can see the little bar jumping, so it's picking up something.
but I was thinking about these laws and for the priesthood, and I was wondering about them. And we know the first command given in the Bible in Genesis is be fruitful and multiply.
Mhm.
And how these might relate to that. And of course, we see it with Noah also, this command again to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And we also see with God's blessing to Abraham. So we see this theme repeated throughout the scripture, and that these laws, these purity laws, were just seemed to be somewhat related to this command to be fruitful and multiply, because they needed to maintain, they needed to be clean, they needed to be pure, they needed to take the ritual bath, they needed to avoid the diseases in order to fulfill this command to be fruitful and multiply. And the priests were the ultimate, they were the symbol, and being the righteous, the leaders, and in charge of the temple and that whole symbolism of the temple structure, and not only the holiness, but to fulfill this command of God to be fruitful and multiply. So I was just thinking in that term and trying to relate that and seeing if there isn't some. So for me, when I think of that, I go, oh, there's even a more broader reason for all the, because we may not understand them in detail and specific, but when we look to fulfill that command, some of these kind of tend to make more sense.
Mhm.
In the law, yeah, okay. Now the inclusion of crust testicles makes more sense.
Yeah, it does. Actually, everything there, when you talk about deformities and the reason, because you think some of that's kind of cruel and inhuman. If you're a hunchback, you can't do it. If you got an arm or whatever. And these rules seem arbitrary at times and kind of cruel and against us today in terms of our righteousness and social justice. But when we think of this was the priesthood, and they were to symbolize the whole nation, and how the nation was also to be fruitful and multiply, and not only physically but spiritually, they were to be fruitful and multiply. So the moral and ethical laws are also to multiply the kingdom of God and the love of God, the righteousness and justice of God. So this be fruitful and multiply has many aspects besides physical and spiritual. So I was just kind of meditating on that. Maybe it's relevant.
Well, definitely, I think you made a good point.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really good. And I also think, it also demonstrates, we can also kind of draw the conclusion too that so yes, for the Kohanim, they have to be, they can't have all of these physical deformities or different things. They can't have, they have to be spotless in some sense. But that also doesn't mean that people who are imperfect are less worth, of less worth. It goes back to this specific role. So it doesn't mean that God hates these people or God has marked these people down. It's a part of this specified role. But I think that it is a good connection too between this commandment, this initial commandment of be fruitful and multiply, and also these ritual purity laws, because one way that we can think about all of these things that make you ritually impure, death, these bodily fluid discharges in blood, and leprosy or skin disease, is that these things all have to do with death. In some sense. And actually this scholar that I listened to, that's how he framed them, that these are forces of death. And when talking about how, and then he went through several things. So think about this as you're reading through whichever gospel of choice you choose. It appears in all of them, but Yeshua confronts people or interacts with people in all of these states. And he restores them. But also, what does he say in many cases? He especially,
Go and sin no more.
Yeah.
He says, go and sin no more, but where does he send some of
He
these
sends them
people?
to the priest.
He sends them to the priest.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, there's a couple different perspectives we could argue about that, but I think that, because some people like to argue that Yeshua doesn't think that ritual purity matters. I would disagree for this very example that, so he heals someone of skin disease and he says, go and show the priest as a testimony.
Yeah.
And because what's going to happen when he goes before the priest? If the priest knew that he had this disease, I don't know. Again, I don't know a lot about this disease, if it was commonly healed or if it was often a lifelong condition. But the priest is probably going to ask some questions of like, what happened? What made you get better? Did you do something different? Who did you meet with? And what's going to happen? Well, I met this man. And I think we could say that about, the woman with the issue of blood for 12 years, I don't remember in the accounts of that story if I don't know that he's necessarily censored the priest, I can't remember. But he's coming directly in contact with her and she is healed or restored. And then we have several stories of him coming in contact with corpses, with people who have died, and kind of mixed. It's interesting to me, both Mark and Luke, kind of the story of the woman with the issue of blood and healing the 12-year-old daughter of one of the synagogue officials are kind of intermixed, which is kind of interesting. Like, he's on the way to go heal this girl and gets kind of interrupted for this other healing, and then he goes on. And I think it's interesting that Mark and Luke both, Mark was probably a source for Luke, so it does make sense. But anyway, that's another topic. But, he goes and he's in contact with this 12-year-old girl. And he goes into the house, which, would make him ritually impure and all these things. So there is this question, because coming in contact with someone who is ritually impure also makes you impure. So, is Yeshua ever ritually impure?
No.
People like to debate that. I don't know. I don't think so. But the point is that he is coming. Yeshua is this source of life. So if we kind of, like I was saying, is that we look at these categories of ritual impurity as all relating to death in some form. So, like I was saying, the scholar his book is called Jesus and the Forces of Death. So he's talking about ritual purity being these forces of death, and Yeshua as this force of life coming against and overpowering these forces of death, which I think is a really interesting way to look at this. And is consistent even with how Yeshua lived. Of course, he's bringing life. Of course, he is the one who brings us eternal life, so this is not a hard connection to make. But just to start to see that in the way that he's interacting with people, with individuals, is really cool. Because even like with Shabbat, like when he interacts with the religious leaders, many of the disagreements that Yeshua has with them are about Shabbat observance. And very often they come back again to this principle of preserving life, which is understood in Rabbinic Judaism. Like you have exceptions for Shabbat for preserving life. Like if somebody gets in an accident and is dying, you help them, even if it's Shabbat. If a woman goes into labor on Shabbat, you deliver the baby. There is this concept of preserving life, but he's kind of even expanding it of there's a fullness of life. It's even preserving the fullness of life and enjoying life. It's like, Shabbat is about all of this goodness of the Lord and interacting with, it's this heaven touching earth moment. So, so going even back to, I was thinking about while Lon was talking about this connection between the commandment to be fruitful and multiply and the implications of some of this ritual purity stuff, is that I think we have an example of how these things kind of go together in the Gospels, because Luke does a really great job of giving us this story about Zechariah. Who is Zechariah?
You mean John the Baptist,
Mhm.
father?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what is his role? Yeah, he's a priest.
Oh,
Sorry.
priest.
Sorry, I wasn't
Oh.
asking the question very clearly.
Yeah.
Yes, he's a priest. And yet, the whole story about Zechariah is about that he's about to have a son.
Right.
So, again, we see this so as a priest, he would have to be observing, he would have had to have been observing some of these ritual purity instructions prior to going to serve his, and again, he's not the high priest, so he's serving probably 2 weeks, he serves about 2 weeks a year. They're on rotation, so they're serving 2 weeks a year. So, and then he's going to go back and live his normal life. But he would have had to be preparing to go and be able to serve in the temple. But at the same time, that's when he comes and finds out that he's going to have a son. And so again, he's being faithful, and he's following these commandments, and also he's following the commandment of be fruitful and multiply. And of course, there's some supernatural interaction there as well. But yeah, hopefully that kind of demonstrates kind of how these go together. Because of course because we also don't want to go so far as to say that, because of course to remain ritually impure, which one, it's impossible for a woman just naturally, but two, so for a man to be ritually pure at all times means he can't be married, and none of this. You would have to be living a celibate life and kind of a very ascetic life. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who are called to that, but I'm saying that that's not God's point, or that's not God's purpose in giving these rules. So it's another aspect that we have to hold this in tension, which I think this Zechariah narrative is helpful for, because, God doesn't want, God wants family. Like, God works through families, right? The redemption and restoration comes through families in many ways, which would mean some occasional instances of ritual impurity. But, so it's holding this tension of living this full life, being fruitful and multiplying, and also having these set apart times, seasons, however long or short those might be, of a little bit of self-denial and a little bit of increased reflection to spend time with the Lord and really hear what he's saying. So, anyway, hopefully that's kind of helpful as far as the ritual purity aspect. Because I know those are often some of the instructions that are a little bit hardest for us to wrap our minds around, because we don't really, again, it goes back to this reality that we don't have a modern kind of temple life that we're living, which in the ancient world was common, and all religions had some kind of purity laws or requirements before going into the temple of their god of choice. And again, it's another way that the God of Israel would look different than all of these other pagan gods, and what he requires to come into the temple.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
So along with all the ritual purity, and at the end of chapter 22,
Mm-hmm.
verse 31, where it says, "So you are to keep my mitzvot, and to do them, I am Adonai.
Mm-hmm.
You must not profane my holy name, for I will be made holy among men Israel. I am Adonai." And I love the flip on this. He says, "Who makes you holy," where
Mhm.
before he said, "Be holy, for I am holy."
Mm-hmm.
But this time he's telling him, "I'm making you holy,"
Mm-hmm.
who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So would you, where he says, "You must not profane my holy name, for I will be made holy among men Israel," and you may have already addressed it at the very beginning, being holy before him, remaining pure before him, would you consider, if they were to minister before him impure, that would in a sense also be not only not obeying his laws, but in a sense profaning his name?
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think that it would have to come before Adonai in a state of ritual impurity, you would have to be violating another commandment. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is being deceitful or lying. Because if you would know, like you know when you're in a state of ritual impurity. That's the nice thing about it. It's like you don't have to guess.
Yeah.
You clearly know if these things are happening.
Yeah.
So if you're choosing to hide that and go into the presence of the Lord anyway, I think that you're violating other commandments of holiness.
Mhm.
So I think that by definition profanes the name of Adonai. So because you're not living in accordance with it, and that's a commandment for all the people. So like, I think that, and I think we could, continue to unravel that a little bit more, but that's just.
Come before him, he's basically telling them, I'm gonna make you holy,
Mhm.
where, I'm gonna help you out on this,
Yeah.
so to speak. If you're
Right.
doing your part, then I can make you holy.
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of intention with that. If it's like, and again, I think it's the kindness of the Lord that these ritual impurity things are so obvious. Again, like like I said, like you don't have to guess. It's not, like they're all very physical things, and so I think that I think there's a lot of even implied grace with that of like it's not like. It's just these specific things, and so then it's not an unreasonable expectation for a level of honesty about them.
Yeah.
And so I think that if you
Especially
choose
if
to
it
go
wasn't
against
your
that.
fault to begin with.
Well, yeah, but it's not about fault, because again, these aren't even about sin.
Yeah.
And so I think that, so I don't think it's fault. I think it's just what God says, and it's just about, it's partially about being honest and transparent and living in community. So if you think about it, it's actually kind of a strange scenario to think about, that you're being very honest about your personal life about a lot of these things, to be able to be coming before the Lord. But it's also why, and I don't remember if it says it in this one. I don't think it does talk about it. But that's even why it's the kindness of the Lord even with the festivals. Like we talk about Passover, and there's kind of an allowance. Like if you are unable to celebrate Passover on the 15th of Nisan when it's commanded, you can celebrate it a month later. And part of that has to do with this.
Mhm.
Like if you're in a state of ritual impurity, again, it's not about fault, it's about life, that you can still you still get to celebrate the feast.
Which is what I loved about you bringing up Yeshua healing these people,
Mhm.
because leprosy,
Mhm.
issue of blood, I mean, this is out of these people's control.
Right.
And so by him healing them, he brought them to a position where they can re-enter the community.
Yeah.
They can serve, and so it's, to me, it goes even beyond just the healing aspect. It's the bringing them back into this pure relationship.
Yeah.
And so it's like there's that even deeper level to it that's really great, because when you sit there and think about these people they can no longer be even a part of their community.
Right. Yeah, it's a big deal, and so I love that, because I think Yeshua restoring these people is multifaceted, because it brings them back into community. Also, these people have legitimate medical issues,
Yeah.
so he's just meeting their physical needs, and even just to think about like the people around them, like the family of the girl who died, they would all be ritually impure as well, and so they're in a sense restored by her coming back to life.
And
So
with leprosy, they had to walk around saying, unclean, unclean. I
Mhm.
mean,
yeah, you're like labeled.
yeah.
And again, it's not about sin, but it is about, and again, I think I would be curious to know kind of in everyday life in places outside of Jerusalem, particularly outside of Israel, how that really happened. Again, I think it changes that when you're closer to times when people are going to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but it'd be really interesting to know.
Further people were from the presence of God, the more unclean they were.
I think so,
And the
because
closer
it's-
you are to God, the more clean you need to be.
Yeah, I don't really like to delineate it that way, because because I think that then that our minds tend to go to, well, then that means you're better than or whatever. And I think that, but I do think that, just practically speaking, I don't think that it, to me, in my mind, and I'm certain there are people who maintained a level of ritual purity outside the land at this time period. But if you're living hundreds of miles away, you're not going to go to Jerusalem, maybe not every year, but every 5 years, because often they probably rotated who went to Jerusalem for the festivals. I don't think it makes sense to hold to the highest standard of ritual purity. Again, I think maybe some people probably did, and I don't think that it was disregarded, but it's about being able to enter the temple. So if you don't have to, then I don't think that I don't know, I just think it looked different. And I don't think that that's bad, and I don't think that those people are less than. Just like I don't think the priests are above anybody else because they have to be more strict about it. So I think we like to create hierarchies in our minds. It's just what we naturally do. That's part of Greek thinking. That's part of the Greek influence that came in to the world. That we just like to we like to say if you're observing more commandments then you're more holy. And in some cases that's true, and in some cases it's like, well, it depends on your role and it depends on what God's called you to do and where He's called you to live and how He's called you to interact. Because even in the context of first century Israel, somebody had to bury people. People died. And people had to bury them. And so there are people who, there were, ancient undertakers, I'm sure, that were constantly in contact. And basically they're sacrificing their ability to go into the temple. And I've read some accounts that they're actually honored because they're basically sacrificing for other people. They're taking care of these issues for other people so that they can go into the temple. So it's all, everybody has to fulfill their role. Mm-hmm. So that's how I prefer to look at it. I think it's a little bit more, I don't know. I feel a little bit more grace about it, I guess. I don't know. Okay. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but unless anybody else has any other comments or questions about ritual purity, we can talk about some of the festivals a little bit. Particularly, I think it's really interesting that all of a sudden it's talking about this holiness and ritual purity, and then it's festivals. I'm like, this seems random. It's just drop this right in here. But, sorry, my allergies are killing me. So, a few weeks ago, I gave a handout, which I have some extras, if anybody would like one, about Leviticus.
Okay, I didn't get one. Okay.
Matt, do you have one or do you want one?
I'll take another one. Thanks.
Do you want one?
Sure.
Do you want one?
Thank you very much.
So this is from a Leviticus commentary that I have. But I find it to be just a simple kind of helpful roadmap for Leviticus and the structure of it. So just kind of and how it falls even within the Torah. So just real quick overview of this diagram. Do you want another copy?
No, we can.
Yeah.
Okay. So kind of, if we can kind of look at Leviticus kind of like the mountain, and if, again, this is another application of, which I know some of you have heard me talk about this a lot, of even the three-part structure of the Mount Sinai experience and how that patterns with the tabernacle. So we see that general structure within Leviticus as well, where we have Genesis and Exodus as kind of this narrative story coming up. And then when we start to Leviticus, through the first section, it's all about blood, and even it includes Genesis and Exodus have a lot to do with blood and issues of all of that. So the first part of Leviticus is we kind of have these different sections, and you can see the chapters, and if you go back through, you'll see how these kind of fall out of kind of going up toward the high point of the book of Leviticus is Leviticus 16, talking about the Day of Atonement. And then we are now kind of on the downward stretch down this other side of this mountain, so to speak, which is all about holiness, which based on our conversation today, hopefully makes a lot of sense. So we started out talking about Leviticus 19, which would fall in this personal laws section. And then we've moved down into talking about the priestly laws in Leviticus 21 and 22. So then as we move into Leviticus 23 with the biblical feasts, we're kind of in the sanctuary laws. So for me, it was helpful to kind of look back at this structure and remember that. Because again, like I feel like it's a big topic switch to go from talking about ritual purity and the priests to the feasts. But if you think about it in the context of this sanctuary laws section, it kind of makes sense because we can go until 9:45. For some reason I was thinking we needed to end at 9:30, but we don't. Oh, good. We can just talk about this a little bit more. I don't need to feel quite so rushed. In the context of the sanctuary laws, I think it makes sense that we have this section about the feasts because the feasts involve basically all the people of Israel, and they involve everybody coming to the tabernacle and all the sacrifices and all the things that are involved with that. And so it's kind of an all play kind of situation again. So in the grand scheme of things, it kind of makes a little bit of sense maybe that we would talk back about the feasts. So with that, this is just of course a real brief overview of the feasts.
Isn't it kind of like, so there's explaining things and the laws and everything, and then, okay, let's all get together now.
Yeah, it kind of is.
Because we've got this figured out.
Right, it's like, okay.
And it's okay to now get together.
Right,
We know
you
the
do all these
requirements.
things, and this is how you all, and then you all get to come.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you all get to come and have a party. And the important thing to point out and notice every time the feasts come up in the Torah is that the first one that's usually talked about is Shabbat. So we have a Moedim every week. So, so I think we tend to talk about holidays and we think of Passover and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and all of those. But Shabbat is a holiday every week, and so it is important to remember that and regard it with a high, just because it happens every week doesn't mean that it's any less important. It's called the Holy Convocation, just as many of the others are. Okay. And so then, I don't know, I'll just give kind of a brief overview, I guess. This, like I said, this is a fairly abbreviated kind of review of the calendar, so I guess this is maybe I would say this is a good passage to kind of earmark when you need a little refresher on the biblical calendar, because this is just a nice little summary. Because of course we have Passover and the Feast of Matzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, starting out first. And it gives us some instruction about the first and the seventh days being called a Holy Convocation, where you're to do no work. So many of the festivals, the first and last days are kind of the holiest days, I guess you could say, that they are, you're not supposed to do any regular work on them. Excuse me. And then we have Bikurim and Shavuot, which is the first fruits. And first fruits is kind of connected with, of course, it connects back with Passover. In our context, of course, we would see that as resurrection. So, does it say it in this one? Okay, so it talks about the counting of the Omer, and it talks about, in verse 15, you're to count from the morrow after the Shabbat, from the day that you bring the Omer in the way of offering. So this is the Shabbat after Passover. And there are different perspectives on what that means. So Kingdom Living, because of course we are in the season of counting the Omer right now, we actually view this differently and observe it differently than the rabbinic calendar. And I'll kind of give you a brief overview of that. I don't want to dive too deep into the technical details. My main purpose is to help you, just so that to make you aware that if you were to look at a traditional Jewish calendar, the dates would not line up, and this is why. So, Rabbinic Judaism interprets this to mean basically that Passover is a Shabbat. And so you would start counting the Omer the next day. We interpret it to mean the actual Shabbat, the seventh day Shabbat, after the festival, and you start counting the day after that. So you can see where you could potentially have about a week's swing in there, depending on when Passover falls, which this year we did, because Passover started on a Saturday evening. So I believe, if I'm thinking about this exactly correctly, that Rabbinic Judaism started counting Sunday evening, meaning the next day, whereas we did not start counting the Omer until the following week. So because we had Shabbat basically a week after Passover, and then we started counting Saturday evening to count there.
Yeah.
So there are some small sects of Judaism that do count that way, but Rabbinic Judaism doesn't. So my main purpose with saying that is to make you aware that if you are to look at a traditional calendar, it would look different. So this is an area where everybody has a different calendar. The calendars in Judaism is very challenging. In most cases, we do kind of line up with the rabbinic calendar because, and Messianic Jewish people who live in Israel typically do, because it runs the actual social calendar, the civil calendar as well. They have days off. The country shuts down. They have kind of their standard holidays based off of that. So of course, it would make more sense even to just observe it, just because that's what the whole country is doing, and you're going to have days off, and so just do that. But Kingdom Living, which based on the reading, the reason part of that is because if it were supposed to, part of the argument for counting in the way that Kingdom Living is counting is that the Torah doesn't give a day for starting the counting of the Omer. And so if you're always supposed to start the day after Passover, it would say, and the 16th of Nisan is day one of the Omer.
Right.
And it doesn't say that. And it doesn't give us a date for Shavuot. It doesn't give a specific date on the calendar of what Shavuot is. So, and every other holiday it does. We have dates for all the other holidays. So that's the reasoning behind it. You're welcome to agree or disagree, but I just wanted to give you that kind of brief overview of there are different perspectives of this and why. So, and Tom always really tries to emphasize, he's much better about talking about the calendar than I am. The calendar is very complicated, and there's a lot of, there's just a lot of opinions about what the correct calendar is. But what it comes down to is that you're trying to observe the feasts, and that doesn't mean that we get free reign and we can do whatever we want.
Right.
But it does mean that we have to have a little grace. We don't have a central authority in Jerusalem. We're not waiting until the priest goes outside and looks for the moon at the beginning of every month to know what day the month starts. We're not going out and looking at the barley in the field to see if it's ripe, to see if we need to add the extra month or not. We're not doing any of those things. So we have to pick a calendar and go with it.
That's right.
Is basically the point. So when it comes to the calendar, we all have to have an extra measure of grace and realize the intention is to honor the Lord and to observe the festivals and do that to the best of our ability. And so when you see or hear or read different things about really strong opinions about the calendar, just have some grace with that. Because no one knows, is the point. When Yeshua comes back, I'm sure he will be happy to reestablish a calendar for us, and we can all be on the same calendar once again. So until he comes, we'll do the best we can. Okay. So, Yeah. So yeah, fall feasts. Again, like we have starting in the 7th month, we have Rosh Hashanah, the feast of the head of the, which is the head of the year, the festival of the trumpets, the blasting of the shofar, on the 1st of the 7th month, and then we have Yom Kippur on the 10th, and then we have Sukkot quickly following that on the 15th, for 8 days. And Tom, I was gonna look it up and try to find his little like PowerPoint that he made last time when Tom taught about this last year. So if you go back on the KL YouTube and look for Tom's teaching from the fall holidays last year, I was gonna try to look it up before so I could at least tell you what date it was, but I didn't do that. He did a really great job, and he had a really great PowerPoint slide even of showing how the fall festivals line out, even with looking at the end times and the return of Yeshua. Because of course we have the spring feasts are kind of, we understand to be fulfilled by Yeshua's first coming, and we are now looking toward his second coming in fulfillment with the fall feasts. And he gave a really great teaching, and again, I was really hoping to have time to go back and look at it so I could at least give you like the bullet points, but I didn't have time to do that, so I don't have that for you. But he just did a really great job of kind of, again, and there's a lot, again, this is another area where we have to have a lot of grace because there's just a lot we don't know about the end times. We don't know a lot about exactly when and how things are going to happen. So be careful with how tightly you hold to some of those things as well. But he did a great job as like even just in a general way and in a kind of just a really high level overview of how we can understand Yeshua's second coming in connection with the fall festivals. So I would really encourage you to go back and find that, to find that teaching from last fall.
It wasn't a Torah study,
It was a main teaching. It was a main Shabbat teaching. Yeah, and if I think about it this week, I'll try to write it down, and maybe next week I can let you know, or maybe I can post it in the, I don't know, sometimes YouTube doesn't like you posting links in the comments of a YouTube stream, but I can maybe go back and put it in a comment on the YouTube stream for this Torah study too. But anyway, any other comments, questions about the calendar? They are, of course, the feasts are all tied to the agricultural calendar in Israel as well. And many of you may know this, but just kind of, because I mentioned earlier, like we had a double portion last week. In the Torah reading schedule, next year there may still always be 1 or 2 double portions, I can't remember. But next year, on the Jewish calendar, we will have an extra month, which will then also push all of the festivals later in the year. Because this year, of course, Passover was really early. The fall feasts are really early. The fall feasts all happen in September this year. I think the last day of Sukkot is like October 2nd. It's crazy. It's so early. Because normally we're kind of into mid-October by the time we get through Sukkot. But next year we will add a month to the Jewish calendar, which will push everything back. So that's kind of because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. It's based on the cycles of the moon, which means if you continue to follow that, like Islam does, your holidays would eventually move throughout the entire year. So that Ramadan is usually the easiest way to notice this for Islam. But eventually Islam will be in every season of the year. But that does not happen with the Jewish calendar, of course, because we need all the holidays to be in the right season, because they have to do with harvests in Israel, and so that's why we call it a solely lunar calendar. There's a 25-cent word for you, and we occasionally add an extra month into the year, which keeps the festivals in the right season.
How often do they do that, add the extra month?
I I knew exactly how many times. It's like a certain number of times within a certain number of years they do it. We haven't had it for a couple of years, but then, and I can't remember, there's a couple of websites that you can go to that will show you 10 years worth of Jewish calendars.
But it's not always the same as far as like our leap year, it's like every 4 years.
It's not like every 4 years. It's not quite that. So when the temple is standing, basically, and that's why you have some of it talks about it, I don't know if it's in this portion. I don't think it specifies exactly in this portion, but it will talk about going to see if part of how they would decide was for Passover, if there were going to be enough lambs for Passover. And part of it is that the barley has to be ready to be harvested at the right time. And so they would actually go and look, and the high priest would decide, we're going to have Nisan start on this day, and nope, we're going to wait another cycle basically and have it start later. There's more to it than that. I get fuzzy on some of the details.
Yeah.
But those were commanded by God, right?
Yes.
The barley, and so that's why they do this adjustment thing? Because
Right.
originally God
Right.
said it's at these times.
Right.
Okay.
And when the lambs are born. like,
Right,
they're
right.
not-
The
Yeah.
barley, the
Yeah.
lamb, yeah.
Yeah, so everything has to be right. And so in, the ancient time, it would be based off of, it would be judged by the priest from year to year. Of course, we have several issues with that now. One, that we don't have a priest, and two, that the world doesn't function that way with that much flexibility. And so Rabbinic Judaism has kind of codified how that works, and so they've designed the calendar on how that works based on the moon cycles and things like that too. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but basically now we can look out 10 years for the rest of time and see what year that we're going to have the extra month and what year we're not, whereas in the ancient world it would be on a year-to-year basis.
That makes sense.
So again, one of those situations where the calendar is not perfect. So because we have no temple, so we can't do it exactly how God says, because we don't have the central authority in Jerusalem, we don't have a temple, and all of these things impact it. So we have to pick a calendar and go with it, is how that happens. So, yeah. Anything else festival related? I don't know that I can answer your questions, but I can try.
And I just was thinking about the first mandate the Lord gave was be fruitful and multiply, but to take care of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously in the foresight and foreknowledge of
Yeah.
the Almighty,
Right.
you realize we still needed to find ways to be tied to the land. So
Mhm.
because we forget, if we live
Right.
in the cities, unless you have plants in your house, you don't think about it.
Right.
And so I really see, it's neat. It's
Mhm.
neat how he takes care of those mandates and tries to bring us back to what he's been asking us to do since he created
Yeah.
the earth in the first place.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before. Why? I've been asking for a long time, why?
Yeah.
And now I see that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, I think this ties back even to our tendency to really elevate and put a lot of significance on spiritualizing things. And the spiritual world we often elevate in our mindset, but God is very physical. He's designed. He gave us bodies, and he created a physical world. And he designed the calendar for people, embodied people, and physical world to interact, like you're saying. And specifically, I think a key part of that too, that is often missing and what we try to emphasize in Messianic congregations, is that it's tied to even specifically the land of Israel.
right.
Because if you were to try to set some of these things based on harvests and things like that in other parts of the world, you would end up with a very different calendar. It doesn't work.
Right.
Either you can't grow that crop there, or it would be ready at a different time. So it even comes back to the significance and the importance of the land of Israel itself. So the class I just am finishing up right now is based on the land and state of Israel. So I've been thinking a lot about the land of Israel the last several weeks. So this is definitely at the forefront of my mind. But I think that that's really important to remember as we are developing our messianic theology, that yes, the Jewish people are important. They are God's chosen people. They are the people who he is giving all of this instruction to, who are kind of to be the example on the earth and a light to the rest of the nations. But the land of Israel itself is also really important to God and to our theology and to how we kind of center the rest of our thoughts about. That's not to say that I agree with everything that modern Israel does. I think we need to use a little discernment because it is a secular state currently, but at the same time, the land of Israel, I think, doesn't ever lose importance to God. And so I think that it is important for us to include that as we develop our theology and our view of God and the Jewish people and how we fit into that. So.
I had a Messianic friend that used to teach on the festivals, and one of the things she loved about Sukkot is she said this was God's way of getting everybody to clean their trees, clean up the land, because they had to build these things from raw materials. She said they had to go out there and collect and clean up the land in order to construct these things. So she said this was the Lord's way of getting them to clean up the land.
Yeah,
to get the fall,
I think that's great. Well, and in the spring, you do this big cleaning in your house in the spring at Passover because you have to get rid of all the leaven in your house is the instruction. So see, the Bible gives us spring cleaning and fall cleanup. You know? Thank you, Lord. All right. Well, it is 9:45, so I will pray to close us and we can go to service. So Lord, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for Shabbat. We thank you that we get to celebrate one of your appointed times every week. I just ask that your presence would be with us in service. I just ask that your spirit would be among us and that we would just be able to see the face of Yeshua as we worship today. Lord, I thank you for all the instruction that you give us. I thank you that you give us practical ways to experience holiness. And I just ask that you would help bring to mind for each of us different ways that we can be intentional about the ways that we approach you, Lord, as you are holy, that you make us, that you would be able to make us holy, that we would hold our part of the bargain so that you can make us holy. And Lord, also we just thank you for the blood of Yeshua. We thank you for that atonement. We thank you for the grace that you've extended us as we try to figure all of these things out. And Lord, we continue to just ask that this level of expectation would rise within each of us as we are in the season of the counting of the Omer, looking toward Shavuot and the celebration of the giving of the Torah and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Lord, I just ask that word and spirit would continue to inspire us and fill us each day. I thank you for each of the people in this room and anybody who watches online now or later. And I just ask that you would just be, that you would just fill us with more of your presence and your spirit, Lord. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.